everything about Jesus hints of his Jewishness. Take his name, Yeshua in Hebrew, a fairly common name in ancient Israel, meaning salvation, and linked with another ancient Israelite name, Joshua. Jesus wasn't a rabbi himself, although he was called rabbi. At the age of 30, he left his home and met John the Baptist, the baptizer, the immerser, whom Josephus says exercised great influence over the people. There's no Christian element in his baptism by John. And as far as we can tell, Jesus never baptized anybody. After remaining for some time in the company of the Baptist, the baptizer, Jesus founded a separate community. This was perhaps because he viewed the kingdom of heaven as being realized in the present, while John the Baptist regarded it as a future messianic aspiration. Jesus went on to select 12 students, talmidim in Hebrew, or disciples, teaching them about many things. But in what language did he speak? Until recently, it was believed that the spoken language of Jesus and his disciples was Aramaic. But today, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's hard to deny that most people, even if they knew Aramaic, were also fluent in Hebrew. Jesus was no ignorant peasant. He was deeply acquainted with both written and oral law. Consequently, the sayings of Jesus are also an important source for our knowledge of the world of the Jewish sages. They pave the way for our understanding of oral law, halakha, and the Jewish commentaries. Let's face it, it's virtually impossible to understand the essential words of Jesus without having some familiarity with rabbinic literature. Jesus lived in a Jewish world in which both written and oral law were flourishing, and that world was dominated by a party known as the Pharisees. Here's what Josephus wrote of them. The Pharisees lived thriftily, giving in to no luxury, for they follow what the word in its authority determines and transmits as good. They believe that to keep what God wished to counsel is worth fighting for. Out of respect, they defer to those advanced in years, nor are they so bold as to stand in opposition to what the elders have proposed, while claiming that everything is affected by destiny. They do not deprive human will of power in these things. For it occurred to God to make a combination and to admit to his counsel the will of men, with its virtue and its vice. Their belief is that there is an undying power in the souls, and that under the ground there is an accounting to reward and punish those who were righteous or unrighteous in this life. Eternal punishment is offered to the latter, but recreation in a new life to the former. Because of these ideas, the Pharisees are the most persuasive among the citizens, and all the sacrifice and prayer offered to God happens to be according to their interpretation of Scripture. In this way, those who live in the cities have witnessed to their virtue in devoting themselves to all the best in their words and way of life. The Pharisees had taught that Moses received not one, but two Torahs on Mount Sinai, one written and one oral. The written Torah comprises the first 5 books of the Bible. The oral Torah, much longer, was taught by Moses to Joshua, who taught it to the next generation, and so on. The Pharisees, in developing and teaching the oral law, paved the way for the many volumes of rabbinic literature that would be set to writing in the centuries to come. That literature, rarely if ever studied by Christians, contains the essence of the oral laws that Jesus also taught and quoted. If you're familiar with the famous novel and film Fahrenheit 451, you recall a story about some future time when the great books of our culture would be passed out and memorized in fear of a decree that they be destroyed. Rabbinic literature is just the reverse. Originally, the oral law was to be committed to memory. It could not be written down. But as time passed, in fear that it could no longer be memorized properly, it was finally set to writing. The result was the Mishnah, a collection of laws, 63 tractates of them, edited, the proper term is redacted, by Rabbi Judah Hanassi in the year 220 of the Common Era. Those 63 tractates are divided among 6 larger divisions or orders. Zra'im, or seeds, dealing with prayer and blessings, tithes and agricultural laws. Moed, or appointed time, containing Sabbath and holiday laws. Nashim, or women, relating to relations between a man and his wife. Nezikin, or damages, all about tort and property law. Kodashim, or sacred things regarding temple service and the laws of sacrifices. And Toharot, or pure things, having to do with attaining a state of ritual purity. Many of these laws cover areas in which the written Torah is silent. For example, the Torah forbids work on the Sabbath day, Shabbat. But what constitutes work? The Mishnah, written entirely in Hebrew, specifies 39 categories of forbidden labor. In another passage, Deuteronomy 8:10, we read, "When you eat and are satisfied, give thanks." Give thanks how? The Mishnah spells out specific blessings to be recited before and after each kind of food, and what to do if the wrong blessing is recited by mistake. Then we have the Talmud, which is essentially a running commentary, a collection of additional oral laws that try to resolve inconsistencies in the Mishnah. For example, the Mishnah relates a case in which 2 people simultaneously find a piece of cloth laying in the field. Each one claims it. But to whom does it belong? Each person must take an oath, declaring that at least half of the item belongs to him. The Talmud, after citing the original Hebrew passage from the Mishnah, launches into a lengthy discourse in Aramaic over the course of several pages, taking up the question of what constitutes a valid kosher oath. That Aramaic discourse is called the Gemara, or Gemara. Finally, after dissecting the ins and outs of oath-taking, the Talmud returns to another brief passage from the Mishnah, subjecting it to the same analytical rigor. The simple rule of thumb is Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud. Bear in mind, the Talmud cannot be read. It must be studied in the lively company of others who debate every word, often from dawn till dusk, Whereas the Mishnah fits into a single volume, the Talmud is an encyclopedia of wit and wisdom, law and folklore, speculation and theologizing that demands a lifetime of study. In fact, the very word Talmud means study. And as if Mishnah and Talmud are not enough to study, we also have many volumes of Midrash, which is commonly defined as the process of interpretation by which the rabbis filled in the gaps found in the Torah. It's a literature that seeks to ask the questions that lie on the tips of our tongues and to answer them even before we've posed them. What made Cain kill Abel? Was it jealousy over his own rejected sacrifice? Why would God choose the sacrifice of one brother over another? Did Isaac know that his father intended to sacrifice him on that altar? Did Sarah know what was going on? These are only a few out of thousands of questions for which the rabbis struggled to answer. There are, we should note, two types of midrash. There's midrash agadah, relating instructive stories and parables. And Jews have always taught by way of parables, and Jesus employs the same technique. There's also midrash halacha, relying and relaying even more Jewish laws and practices. Interestingly, many Christian scholars think that keeping the commandments, especially the oral law, was somehow a problem for Jesus. While it's true that the New Testament records certain disputes regarding the keeping of particular commandments, most of them center on minutiae. For example, we're told that some Pharisees criticized Jesus' disciples for not washing their hands before a meal. But it was only during Jesus' time that this custom was established at all. Then there's the question of Jesus healing people on the Sabbath. Furthermore, healing through speech was permitted by Jewish law, even in cases where it was not a matter of life and death. And any healing was always permitted in cases of life and death, even on the Sabbath, even on Yom Kippur. Then there's the case of Jesus' disciples plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath. Was this a violation of Jewish law? Not according to the Galileans, who held that this was permissible as long as they were rubbed by hand and one did not use one's fingers. Again, this is trivia and hardly worthy of the claim that Jesus relaxed Jewish law. Jesus was scrupulous in keeping the commandments, often agreeing with the conservative school of the Pharisee Shammai when it came to such matters as divorce and the question of proselytism. On various ideological matters, Jesus was closer to the house of Hillel, which became authoritative in rabbinic Judaism down to the present day. Hillel, who lived in the 1st century BCE, famously declared, "That which is hateful to yourself, do not do to your neighbor." Jesus changed the statement from a negative to a positive. Love your neighbor as yourself. It can be generalized that Shammai's teaching was motivated by a fear of sin, while Hillel's centered on the love of one's fellow. If we think of Jesus himself as a Pharisee, he likely formed a bridge between Shammai and Hillel. Like other Pharisees of the day, Jesus regarded the Torah and its every letter as a world complete in itself, on which the existence of the physical world depends. In his eyes, the smallest commandment weighs as heavily as the greatest. To that extent, he shared the worldview of the ancient sages and the pious Hasidim. By being stringent in moral matters, he wanted to develop the humanitarian side of Judaism. He echoed the view of the Pharisees that one who even glances at a married woman has committed adultery in his heart. The sages had noted that the very word adultery in Hebrew, tinaf, contains 4 letters, going on to comment that a man commits adultery in 4 ways: with his eyes, his hands, his heart, and his feet. Such sayings of Jesus are in fact hard to understand without studying Mishnah and Talmud. Bear in mind, the Gospel of Matthew, arguably edited later when the movement of Jesus was already beginning to separate from traditional Judaism, presents the views of Jesus as opposed to those of the sages. However, there really is no difference between the views of Jesus and the authentic Jewish traditions of his day. Sadly, Christian tradition has turned the Pharisees into straw men for Jesus. And it's no exaggeration to say that the Pharisees have received the bum rap of the centuries. And since the Pharisees are the direct forebears of rabbinic Judaism as we know it today, the result of all the unfortunate stereotyping has been 20 centuries of vicious anti-Semitism. What we're saying is that the Gospels themselves, in the way they've been read, have unwittingly given birth to a good measure of anti-Semitism. And that's something we have to confront. What about Jesus' charge against the Pharisees, that they are hypocrites? Well, that wasn't the first time that Jews used the term hypocrite. The Talmud tells us that Alexander Yanai said to his wife, "Fear neither the Pharisees nor those who are not Pharisees, but fear only the hypocrites." Tzvu'im, or colored ones in Hebrew. This reminds us of Jesus' comparison of the Pharisees to whitewashed sepulchres that are full of maggots inside. According to another passage, Jesus claimed that the Pharisees lay heavy burdens on the shoulders of others while being unwilling even to lift a finger. Well, again, we find that Jesus did not speak in a vacuum. The Jerusalem Talmud speaks of the so-called Shechemite Pharisee as followed: "He lays the burden of the commandments on the shoulder." The word for shoulder in Hebrew happens to be Shechem, the name of the ancient Israelite city, as well as the modern Palestinian city of Nablus. Shechem, it was called. Hence the term Shechemite, or shoulder Pharisee. It seems that Jesus and the Talmud are on the same page, so to speak. But Christians wouldn't know this without studying rabbinic texts, and Jews wouldn't know it without studying the New Testament. And speaking of the same page, we might want to consider a few sayings from one of the greatest Pharisee sages of all, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who also lived during the 1st century and was personally responsible for the survival of Judaism beyond the catastrophe of the Great Revolt. If you have a sapling in your hand and someone should say to you that the Messiah has come, stay, complete the planting, and then go to greet the Messiah. Acts of loving kindness now supersede sacrifices as the preferred way of attaining God's forgiveness. For benevolence on the part of a nation has the atoning power of a sin offering. As the prophet Hosea declared, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." If you have learned much of the Torah, do not take credit for it, for this was the purpose of your creation. Ben Zakkai, like Yeshua, also warned against an obsessive devotion to study, emphasizing that piety was just as important as scholarship. Whoever possesses both these characteristics at the same time is like an artist who has his tools in his hands. Bottom line, when Jesus criticizes the Pharisees, he's doing nothing different from what Jewish sages themselves did. Christians commonly assume that Jesus had a bone to pick with the Jewish leaders, and that those same leaders were ultimately out to do him in. Oh, really? With all the negative stereotyping of Jews and Jewish leaders, little consideration is given to the fact that the Jewish sages themselves were just as critical of hypocrites as Jesus. In the Talmud, 7 types of Pharisees are listed, and 5 of them are called hypocrites. Also in the Gospels, Jesus declares, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they bid you, observe and do." Does this sound like someone who was relaxing Jewish law? He goes on to say, "But do not do after their works." Clearly, he's making a distinction between the negative types of Pharisees and those whose teachings are positive and upright. He saw in the Pharisees the heirs of Moses, and therefore the true interpreters of the Torah. But he also criticized them for not doing what they called others to do. When it comes to what the Pharisees actually stood for, it's no exaggeration to say that Jesus agreed with 95% of everything they taught. That included the whole notion of an oral law that supplements and reinterprets the Torah, and the whole concept of the resurrection of the dead, a doctrine the Pharisees had widely taught for over a century before Jesus was born. What about Jesus' famous criticism of certain customs of the Pharisees, such as this statement attributed to him: "Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long." Matthew 23:5. What are phylacteries? It's the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew tefillin, small leather boxes containing Hebrew texts on vellum, worn by Jewish men at morning prayer as a reminder to keep the law. The same verse references the fringes attached to the corners of a male Israelite's daily garment. They were worn in fulfillment of the biblical commandment, "You shall make yourself tassels on the 4 corners of your garment, with which you cover yourself." Deuteronomy 22:12. The Pharisees interpreted this in a literal way, and the ancient cloak ultimately evolved into what we call today a prayer shawl. Is it odd that Jesus would criticize this custom when the New Testament tells us that he wore such a cloak himself? We read, "A woman who was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched the hem of his garment." Matthew 9:20. So, did Jesus act like a Pharisee even while criticizing them? Was he simply criticizing the hypocrisy among certain Pharisees? Or was Jesus perhaps himself a Pharisee? Those are just a few of the questions posed by textual critics.